All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unraveling the deeply tragic and complex timeline of 13-year-old Dylan Redwine. Back in November 2012, what should have been a normal Thanksgiving holiday turned into this massive, multi-year investigation after Dylan completely vanished during a visit to Vallecito, Colorado. What we're about to look at is honestly a masterclass in not just forensic evidence, but criminal psychology. It shows how a perpetrator's own behavior can actually piece together the very puzzle they tried so hard to destroy. So we're going to look directly at the facts, the timelines, and the behavioral cues exactly as they unfolded.
What actually happens when a 13-year-old vanishes during a forced holiday visitation? It's a chilling question, right? But it really sets the stage for our entire analysis today. You see, Dylan didn't just happen to be hanging out in Vallecito. This was a court-ordered visit to stay with his father, Mark Redwine. And establishing that right up front is absolutely crucial because it helps us understand the heavy dynamic at play here. Dylan was placed in a specific environment at a specific time under immense psychological pressure. For investigators, that creates a really rigid starting point. When a child vanishes under highly controlled, mandated circumstances like this, the circle of initial inquiry becomes incredibly tight.
So, let's look at the first critical window of this investigation. We're talking about the night of November 18th going into the morning of the 19th. Now, according to Mark Redwine's initial statements, he said his son went to sleep around 9 p.m. Mark claims Dylan was still right there in the house at 7:30 a.m. when Mark left to run some errands. When he returned at 11:30 a.m. to an empty house, Mark supposedly just assumed Dylan went to see some friends. But here's the thing, Mark didn't start actively looking for him or even call the authorities until around 3 p.m. That is a glaring lack of urgency, and you can bet it immediately caught investigators' attention and raised some massive red flags.
And this brilliantly illustrates how digital forensics can immediately pressure test human testimony. Just look at how this timeline starkly contradicts the narrative we just talked about. Dylan sent his very last text message at 9:37 p.m. on the 18th. Remember? That's shortly after Mark claimed he was already asleep. Furthermore, Dylan had made concrete plans to meet up with a friend early the next morning at 6:30 a.m. Well, Dylan never showed up. And when that friend texted asking where he was, radio silence. No response at all. So by the time Mark supposedly left a sleeping Dylan at 7:30 a.m. to run his errands, Dylan had already missed the scheduled meetup, and his phone had been completely dark for 10 whole hours.
Now, what's really interesting here is how the details of a cover story often unravel when scrutinized by someone who truly knows the victim. During a really tense appearance on the Dr. Phil show, Mark exhibited classic distancing behavior. Very defensive body language. He claimed that when he returned to an empty house, Nickelodeon was playing on the TV and Dylan's fishing pole was missing. Well, Dylan's mother, Elaine, immediately rebutted this on national television. She pointed out that Dylan watched MTV, not Nickelodeon, and he had absolutely zero interest in fishing. She basically bluntly called out Mark's inability to invent a believable alibi. And adding to this chilling picture, Elaine revealed that Mark's only communication with her about their missing son was a single text message, and he had actively blocked her phone number.
The behavioral evidence surrounding Mark only grew more concerning as the search efforts stalled. According to Elaine and Dylan's older brother Corey, Mark made absolutely no attempts to help search for Dylan. He never attended community events to raise funds or awareness. But the polygraph testing, that's where things get highly specific. Mark admitted he failed his first polygraph and that a second one was inconclusive. Then, when offered a chance to take another one during his television appearance, he agreed, but pushed it to the next day. And then, the following day, just 20 minutes into the test, he canceled it entirely. His excuse? He claimed he felt unwell because he'd only gotten 3 hours of sleep and drank half a bottle of Jim Beam whiskey the night before. In behavioral analysis, suddenly citing physical exhaustion or a hangover to avoid a polygraph is a textbook avoidance tactic used by guilty parties to escape the hot seat.
Of course, investigators didn't just look at Mark's current behavior, they really dug into his history. And this brings us to a chilling statement provided to investigators by Mark's ex-wife, Betsy Horvath. Multiple people corroborated that Mark had a really short temper and a long history of violence. Horvath reported that during their 6-year marriage, Mark was abusive, but the detail that absolutely locked in the attention of law enforcement was her claim that Mark once explicitly told her that if he ever had to hide a body, he'd put it in the mountains. She also reported that Mark had threatened to kill their children before he would ever let her have custody of them.
8. That number is devastatingly significant. On June 27, 2013, roughly 7 months after he vanished, the first of Dylan Redwine's remains were discovered scattered in the rugged, isolated terrain near Middle Mountain Road. This was not a place someone just wanders into by accident, It was deliberate. It was extremely remote. And the exact location of those remains? Exactly 8 miles up the mountain from Mark Redwine's front door.
Let's see how this builds a concrete forensic picture. When those initial remains were found in 2013, Dylan's skull was missing. And shortly after this discovery, Mark made an incredibly eerie comment to Dylan's brother. He stated that investigators would have to find the rest of the body, specifically mentioning the skull, before they could ever determine what happened. Well, fast forward to November 1st, 2015. The skull is finally recovered about 1.5 miles away from the initial remains, and the forensic analysis was definitive. The skull showed clear signs of blunt force trauma and marks consistent with a knife. Plus, experts entirely ruled out animal attacks or natural occurrences. Wildlife does not inflict these specific tool marks, right? Nor do animals carry a body 8 miles up into the mountains. The physical evidence absolutely dictated that Dylan's body was moved and hidden by a human being.
So the crucial point is understanding the dynamic before November 18th. We really have to pivot back to the motive here. Why did this happen? Well, it turns out Dylan had been highly vocal with multiple people about his strong dislike for his father and his absolute dread regarding this specific trip. In fact, right before this court-ordered visit, the 13-year-old took an incredibly rare and extreme step for someone his age. He stood before a judge and explicitly stated he did not feel comfortable around his father. He cited his father's anger and how Mark constantly spoke poorly about Dylan's mother and brother. But as investigators found out, there was another, far darker reason for Dylan's extreme fear.
Maintaining a strictly objective view of the evidence here, we have to look at what Dylan actually found. Dylan had discovered a series of deeply disturbing, highly compromising photographs of his father. These images reportedly showed Mark dressed in women's clothing, wearing heavy makeup, and wearing a diaper. Another photograph apparently depicted Mark consuming feces from that diaper. Dylan was deeply, deeply unsettled by this discovery. According to friends and family, he had actually taken pictures of these photos to hold on to them. This establishes a grim and highly volatile context for the relationship heading into that Thanksgiving visit.
And this brings us to the primary working theory surrounding the motive, which was articulated strongly by Dylan's older brother, Corey. Corey, who had also seen these disturbing photographs, believes that the catalyst for the murder was a direct confrontation. The theory is that Dylan, who, remember, already didn't want to be there and was deeply uncomfortable with his father, confronted Mark about these bizarre images on the night of November 18th. For a controlling personality deeply invested in a hidden double life, being exposed and judged by their own child was likely a psychological trigger that turned deadly.
Now, while the timeline and the motive were coming together, investigators were quietly amassing undeniable physical evidence from inside Mark's home. Interestingly, Mark had actually remodeled his home in March 2012, claiming a fire had damaged it. He firmly maintained Dylan had never suffered any injuries inside. But the forensics? They told a completely different story. Blood consistent with Dylan's was found on a living room love seat, more blood on the corner of a coffee table, even more hidden underneath a living room rug. And when specialized cadaver dogs were brought in, they didn't just hit on the living room. They alerted to the scent of human remains in Mark's truck. They hit on his washing machine. They even hit on the specific clothes Mark was wearing the day Dylan disappeared. The physical walls were rapidly closing in.
Years of meticulous evidence gathering, forensic analysis, and peeling back the layers of Mark's fake emotional displays finally reached their culmination. On July 22, 2017, nearly 5 years after Dylan sent that final text message, Mark Redwine was arrested. The justice system was finally moving forward, charging him with second-degree murder and child abuse resulting in death, with his trial officially scheduled for September of 2019.
And the stakes for those charges were absolutely immense. Each of those severe charges carries a maximum penalty of 48 years in prison. The justice system was finally preparing to hold Mark fully accountable for the destruction of his son's life and the years of deception that followed.
This case is just a profound reminder that we leave traces of the truth everywhere. It's in the texts we send, in the microscopic drops of blood left under a rug, and in the sheer geographical reality of where things are hidden. It leaves us with a powerful question to reflect on. When forensic evidence speaks so loudly and clearly, how long can the darkest family secrets truly stay buried? Thank you for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the details, and I'll see you next time.